1 bar, the room is allocated. 2 bar, me the room is meditating. 2 gold bars, and the body levitating. 4th one, catch you by surprise. 5th one, right behind. We don't talk about the next one, we just flip it in the night. Say it 3 times. Just the one of the greatest artists ever be alive on the mic. He inspired me to be an artist. Bet you didn't know I was rapping on an end and the big right. No, I don't want big right. He earned their respect, he deserves everything he did. Hidden in the scene, right? Okay, alright. A man is supposed to be just fine. I just wanna matter, but sometimes I don't see why. I just see my life, looking back at how I bleed, but I don't even bleed right. Okay, alright, I just sing right. Doesn't mean right. No, don't let it go, don't let it go. That's not how it's supposed to be, right? You were supposed to show her, give her the world. Hope you enjoy drowning in the sea, right? Look at me, right? Working on the 7th bar, somehow people won't even see me, right? This is not even a diss. 8 bars will make you hot as shit. Stuck on the 9th bar, never really truly live till you live. Will it sink in? Life going by, is it even worth blinking? Got me thinking, need a reason. 10 bars for a whole new season. We focus on the now, don't worry about it. There ain't no turning back. Burdens are the heavy, especially when 11 part starts to create a burning path. 12 part, I'm addressing the lesson learned. Bread is burned, gas ain't never last. 13, I'm cleaning the slate, but the stain is still there. Permanent cat, 14 more doors closed. I'm just trying to find the one that ain't slamming my face. 15, living in a dream, but the nightmare creeps in, can't escape my own pace. 16, this is for the one I couldn't say. 17 got me feeling like a ghost in a cave. 18 years old, and I'm just screaming out, hoping someone hears the pain. 18 years old, and I'm just screaming out, hoping someone hears the pain. 19 on the scene, but I'm feeling slow, and she is insane. 2020 vision getting blurry from the stains and tears that I've been drinking. 21 the fun is done, and reality starts to sink in. 22 to tell you the truth, what the hell am I? 23 you and me know the end, that was supposed to be. 24 I ignore what my heart was telling me. 25 I'm alive, but I don't know what I'm living for. 26 throwing bricks at the mirror, trying to fix my own reflection. 27 second guessing every single one of my connections. 28 I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. 29 I'm fine, but I know I gotta stop pretending like I'm okay. 30th part that the war just begun, and I'm already lost. 32 who knows the pain will feel so cold. 33 that's me that you seen is a story that's been sold. 34 I'm on the floor, but I'm reaching for the door. 35 I try to feel alive, but I don't know what for. 36 I'm making tricks with the pain, trying to make it make sense. 37 is a 7, no, it's just another form of suspense. 38 I'm late to my own fate, I'm stalling at the gate. 39 I'm designing my decline, isn't that great? 40 surely someone told me that I was meant to face a thorn. 41 I'm numb, turn the sun into a place that I can mourn. 42 I'm breaking through the ceiling, but I'm still on the floor. 43 she said she needs some space, I don't know what that's for. 44 I'm ignoring all the signs, don't know how I'm a lot, just barely hope you understand. 46 I'm making fix, getting sick of all this contradiction. 47 is this heaven again, I've been questioning my conviction. 48 I'm waiting on a sign, wasting my own time. 49 I'm on the grind, but I'm losing my entire mind. 50 I was there, do I even care? Nah shit, 50 bars in, still the same shit since I started falling. Then 51 started to fall in. Nah, 52 I'm losing track, but I'm finding my soul, yeah. 53 gotta break the habit, gotta break the mold, yeah. 54 I'm on the floor, but I'm asking for some more, yeah. 55 mixing pain with fame, it's a dangerous game, huh? 57 looking at the heaven, looking for a better way, huh? 58 I'm late to my own funeral, standing at the gate, huh? 59 I'm designing my climb, but I'm changing my fate, huh? 60 is barred, I'm seeing clear through the scars. 61 the war isn't done, I'm not here to run. 62 who knew I can make it through all the things that I've been through. 63 is a mystery that I've been starting to believe in me. But 64 I'm ignoring what they said, I'm restoring what's in my head. 65 I'm alive, not just breathing, my fighting instead. 66 throwing bricks out the doubt, now I'm building a house. 67 second guessing my blessing, now I'm counting them out. 68 I'm waiting for the moment when it comes, but I'm still climbing out of the dark place. 70 that's the mark, where her turns to art. 71, the war is almost done. I can see the sun. 72, who knew that scar would feel like gold. 73, that's me. That you see that I was once supposed to be. 74, I'm on the floor, but I'm not there anymore. 75, I'm trying to feel alive. Now I know what it's for. 76, mixed tricks with the truth. I'm producing my own proof. 77, is this heaven? Not this peace after the storm. 77, is this heaven? Not this peace after the storm. 78, I'm on time to my own fate. No more stalling at the gate. 79, I'm resigning my decline, and I'm making it great. Doesn't matter how many times I gotta say it, but 80 is far in, and I'm finally breaking the surface. The skin, what? 81, the race isn't done, but I already won, huh? 82, I knew I could make it through all the things. I'm in victory. Now I'm who I'm supposed to be. 84, I'm in my own lane, watching on the old thing. 85, I'm alive, and I'm thriving, no more riding inside. 86, I'm taking the pain and learning every lesson. 87, I was counting the bar, now I'm counting my blessing. 88, I'm not waiting no more. I was the one I was waiting for. 89, I'm fine, no, I'm greater than fine. 90, I'm the creator of time. Nah, not really. 91, I might choose a specific word that can grow you and lead to the throne. So you better rock it home. 93 to me, that's the same, the one that was always in me. So 94, I'm not on the floor again. No more. 95, try to stay alive now. I'm helping others survive now. 96, I made it to the end of the tunnel, it's bright now. 97, this is heaven. Now it's just the rest of my life. 98, I'm on time. I'm in my place. I can finally see my own face. 99, I'm on the side. My own fate. 100 bars from the scars to the stars. I was counting the pain, now I'm counting the bars. I just want to say that you never die, and I'm proving them right. On the end of the beat, I turn the